Thank you guys for waiting. It's nice to have a group here today, especially as we get to the end of the semester. And so thank you for coming out and seeing our exhibition, which is the fruit of a really wonderful collaboration or partnership since I got here a couple of years ago between Elizabeth Meyer and the DAP Library, and also Kate Stevens, the UC Art Collection, and Aaron Cowan, and myself. The exhibition features about 20 works of art, and I think about 16 of them come from the DAP Library's own special collections. And we've been working together to build up special collections to focus on the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, mostly European things, but when we can, we try to purchase or get donations of other things. Like we have a wonderful Ethiopian scroll here that I'll tell you about. The UC Art Collection has some nice things like this Mughal miniature. And then I think we bought at least one Japanese print as well. So we're trying to use the funds that we have at the library to build up a collection of works of art that are affordable, because usually they're not in great condition. They're not pristine prints. They're damaged in one way or another. They come from dealers and gallerists who actually focus on helping universities and colleges build up their teaching collections, and so they're not trying to gouge private collectors. But this wonderful partnership, which makes teaching history of art and museum studies, which is what I do in the School of Art, it makes it great fun for me, and I think the students that I have are really engaged by actually getting to handle these objects, because in the library itself there's a space where we can take them out of their mats, we can hold them up to the light and look for watermarks and things like that. There's also another partner in this collaboration, the UC Preservation Laboratory. UC's lab, which is based in Langsam Library, has a wonderful staff that they conserve works of art that have tears and need actual work. They figure out the best way to preserve those works. They rehouse them in mats. Those of you who came on Tuesday to the gallery talk learned a lot about that, and so I feel grateful to have their support, their expertise, and often people like Holly right here come to my classes and teach me and my students about the materials and techniques of printmaking, of manuscript illumination. So it's great between the UC Art Collection, the DAP Library, UC Libraries, and the Preservation Lab, and the School of Art to have this partnership. My gallery talk today is just going to be a short introduction to the exhibition. I'm going to talk to you about 4 different themes or groups of objects here, and try to pick out maybe 1 or 2 to go into for a few minutes. All of these works are quite small. There is the glass, and there's often another layer of plastic, so I know the glare is bad. At any time, by all means, come up and look at things. I could never successfully get anyone to do this during the talk, so that's why I don't want to talk very long. I'd much rather have you guys come up during or after, and we can look at things together where you can see the details and you don't have to take my word for it. 1 or 2 other things. This exhibition, the types of exhibitions we try to do in this case, sometimes they complement the courses I teach. So I taught a medieval art survey, and I taught a course called Global Renaissance Art. And the latter course was a new experience for me when I got here. The head of the School of Art and the head of the art history program asked me to teach something that wasn't just entirely Eurocentric, a typical Italian or Northern Renaissance art course. It's a tough job when your training has to be circumscribed geographically and chronologically to be an expert. So many of you probably will know more than I do about some of the artistic traditions represented here, or that intersect with European traditions. So when we look at ornament prints, as we will in a minute, European ornament prints that focus on Chinese motifs or chinoiserie, or Mughal miniatures, Ethiopian Christian art, Ottomans represented by Europeans, things like this, I'm still learning, so I beg your forgiveness in advance. The other thing to say is that most of our works in the collection are prints, woodcuts, etchings, and engravings, because they're affordable. That's one of the main reasons that we have them. We also have manuscript cuttings or leaves, so pages from prayer books and things like that. And then sometimes we range later in time, like the 19th century, to buy objects that we could never get. We could never get an original copper plate from the Renaissance period, but there's some wonderful 19th and 20th century works that give us a best approximation of the kinds of things that we still want to know more about. This is an etched copper plate that tells students more about the techniques of printmaking. All right, so the exhibition is called European Art in a Global Perspective, and it focuses on the late medieval manuscript illuminations that you see in the bottom row, 3 on the right, 2 on the left, mostly from the 14th and 15th centuries, and then early modern prints from about 1500 to 1700. We added in this one print by a female printmaker, a British woman, Anne Allen, because I believe it's the first artwork by a woman that we have in the collections here that probably predates 1900. There's a wonderful collection of artist books in special collections with women artists, but I wanted to add that just because it's important. Obviously, part of teaching a global Renaissance course, the idea is to create a more kind of inclusive and global view of this period. My course, Global Renaissance, is a bit of a misnomer. It's more of a sexy title to draw students in. To teach a Global Renaissance course fairly, you'd want to focus on multiple traditions and give them their due. A better title, and in fact a title related to our textbook, European Art in a Global Perspective, is fairer just because European art's my training, and what we can do to take small steps towards a less Eurocentric view is at least to think about European artworks, most of these are European artworks, from a global perspective, and think about how Europeans depict cultures and peoples from the Americas or Asia or Africa. In the class itself, where I can show reproductions and slides, we focus a lot more on other artistic traditions, Japanese art, Indian art, African art, and their representations of Europeans. But this show, just to say up front, is going to focus much more on European representations of others. So I hope that the one-sided presentation that we have here, at least you know the broader context in the case of the course overall. It's a long introduction, but the 4 themes of the exhibition, the 4 groups, the top row are indeed European representations of Ottoman Turks, Indians, Brazilians, Egyptians, and Black Africans in various situations. The second group, which is just these 2 works right here, these are our Asian and African illuminated manuscripts and scrolls. So just a Mughal miniature of Akbar and this pair of scrolls that we'll talk about. The group here, middle row on the right, these 4 works represent traveling artworks and traveling artists. Artworks that circulated globally, broadly, and I'll talk about one in a moment. Albrecht Dürer is one of the famous printmakers of the European tradition. He's also an artist who traveled widely in Europe and whose artworks traveled widely, not just in Europe, but were often ones that were taken by Christian missionaries, whether they went to the New World or to Japan or to India. So we'll speak a little bit more about Dürer's work and these wonderful ornament prints that spread artistic ideas far and wide. And then the 4th grouping, which is the bottom row, mostly illuminated manuscript leaves, and then 1 copper plate and an impression taken from that plate. These were a nod towards my medieval art course. In the context of European art in a global perspective, the easy way out is to say that many of the most luxurious pigments, including gold leaf that you see on King David's crown or around this Fall of the Rebel Angels, or some of the beautiful blues like King David's robe, came from materials, resources that came from Western and Southern Africa in the case of gold, and then lapis lazuli, the semi-precious stone from which ultramarine paint was created, which comes from present-day Afghanistan. So in this small miniature here, the Virgin Mary presents Jesus to the high priest in the temple, and her wonderful blue robe with gold striations or chrysography is of lapis. So the global aspect of these works, or the more geographically broad aspect, relates to the materials. And for copper plates in this period, most of the copper mines were in Germany, whether the artist was Italian or from another part of Europe. So we threw that in because we also wanted some 3-dimensionality to the show. beyond just the scrolls here. So sometimes it's a matter of curatorial decision-making for the appeal of the show. So we have our 4 themes, and I'd like to start with one of the larger works, and one of the more interesting works, which is Albrecht Dürer's Mass of St. Gregory. Because of time, I'm not going to go into some of the intricacies of iconography, but I'll just say for the moment that there's a scene in Christian hagiography, St. Gregory the Great of the 6th century. He has a vision at one point of Jesus Christ crucified rising from the altar at which he is praying and performing the ritual of Mass. One of the people in the audience with Gregory doubts that Jesus, his body and blood, are literally in the Eucharistic host and wine, and so this vision is to handle those doubts. What I want to say about this work is Dürer created this woodcut in the early 16th century, and this is the type of composition which is all about the authority and the truthfulness, the authoritativeness of Christ's body and blood in the wine and the bread. This is the kind of work that Franciscan and Jesuit and Dominican missionaries, Christian missionaries, took with them when they started to found schools of art and music, whether in the New World or in Japan or in India in the 16th and 17th centuries. One of their underhanded strategies for converting populations, and I should say the Christian friars were much more reasonable, much less violent than, for instance, Spanish conquistadores, who would often force conversions. The friars, and many of them that we speak about in our class, were those who actually stood up for indigenous populations, who thought that these types of Native Americans, whether it's the Aztecs and other peoples in Central America, should have all of the rights of Europeans. They shouldn't be treated as slaves. They shouldn't be treated as children who can't understand religious ideas. They should be those who have the freedom to choose to become Christians. So it was prints like these, which friars brought with them for their evangelization efforts, that were then, in these schools set up by Spanish and Portuguese missionaries, used as the basis for creating works of art in indigenous media. So I'm showing here a reproduction. I have a few I'll just pass around, of an Aztec feather painting. There's no tradition of feather painting, of taking feathers and literally laying them on to create a composition in Europe, and there never was afterwards. But this tradition, practiced in both Central and South America, created some of the most beautiful artworks that were revered by European collectors, that were revered in their own traditions. And this is the same scene. Dürer's print is not a model for this particular representation. But I just want to say that it was a Spanish Christian strategy to have indigenous art makers use Christian designs and prints like Dürer's, and in this case another follower of Dürer's, to create artworks that might better appeal to the indigenous populations they were trying to convert. So for instance, not only using a native technique, but also adding things like the pineapples, which you can see resting on the tomb altar to Christ's right, or putting this scene out of doors. If you look at the background, it's all blue. It's thought that it's out of doors rather than inside of the church, because one of the other kind of insidious ways that Christians tried to convert the populations en masse was to adopt the ideas of sacrifice, Aztec sacrifice, that took place outdoors, and say, you had sacrifice, you had outdoors, we're going to talk to you about the sacrifice of our God, the self-sacrifice of Jesus, and we're going to have our altars outdoors as well. So they tried to kind of co-opt some of the practices that they found in an effort to make conversions more successful. just going to say that I want to show this as a traveling artwork, and Durer himself as a traveling artist. One of the things we focus on in our class that it's not part of our exhibition is that Durer left a very elaborate diary in 1521 when he traveled to the Netherlands and elsewhere, and he was able to see an exhibition of some 150 objects that came from the Aztecs and from the New World, and he left some of the most glowing compliments for the Mesoamerican gold metalwork, the goldsmithery, as well as feather paintings. And so if an artist the caliber of Durer, who we consider kind of the greatest Renaissance printmaker, an amazing painter, designer, also kind of a collector, connoisseur, if he is praising genuinely in his diary, which was for his own thoughts, it didn't have a wider readership, these artists, it's clear from his work, his account and others, just the extraordinarily high level of quality of feather paintings, of gold work. And this is the other theme that I try to hit home in my course, which we can't show here. So many of the artistic technologies and practices, Chinese porcelain, inlaid gold and silver metalwork from the Mamluks in northeastern Africa, feather painting from Brazil and from the New World, were considered so much more glorious and technically accomplished than anything that European artisans and craftspeople could do at the same time. And we see this again and again in European accounts from people of all sorts, none of whom had a particular reason or agenda to praise these other technologies. So we can talk about that in class. I can only really show you from our collection the European things, but when I show you reproduction of the feather painting, it's just good to keep in mind that the quality and the reaction of Europeans was just extraordinary, and artworks like this one, which was destined for the Pope in Rome, were used as evidence for the intellectual and cultural status, high status, of indigenous peoples, in this case, the Aztecs. They were used in the major debates throughout the 16th century about why they shouldn't be enslaved, why they shouldn't be treated as children, why there should be conversion efforts, but they should have the decision to convert or not. And so it's interesting from an art historical perspective that art can be used to make these serious debates. And I want to say also the artworks that travel. These two here on the right are both called ornament prints. This one is from the mid-16th century. One of the artistic centers and cultural centers of Europe in this period was Fontainebleau, south of Paris, where King Francis I of France drew together Italian, French, and other artists to create really interesting new so-called Mannerist iconography. So it's after Leonardo and Michelangelo and Raphael's kind of classical periods where the human body in all its kind of anatomical proportion is the norm. And so we start to get really overly muscled figures. We get beings and bodies that are stretched and distorted, as you see in these two hybrid figures. And we get motifs like masks and other things that overtly say that art is a fiction. The idea of a mask in this period, everything about art is deceptive. So prints like this traveled all over Europe and also to the New World. I just wanted to show this as a backstory to this Anne Allen print. Anne Allen, we don't know much about her. She lived in the late 18th century in London and then moved to Paris. She married the artist, the draftsman and painter, Jean Pillemont, who designed this. And her most popular works, and in this period, Chinese motifs and chinoiserie in France, but all over Europe, were extremely popular. Her most popular works were making prints after her husband's designs and inking them with different colors in a beautiful way. And so this kind of print would have traveled not just all around Europe itself, but these also would have traveled around the world, spreading the ideas that were in fashion, not just in Paris, but elsewhere. And so this idea of ornament prints goes back hundreds, I guess we span about 250 years right here. And there are women printmakers, there are women artists in the 15th and 16th century, but as you'd expect, their works are harder to collect and more expensive. So we're trying, but Anne Allen's work is a kind of a great stand-in, even if it's a little bit later. I'm just going to talk about one work from this group of European fantasies, imaginative representations of other peoples and cultures The central work, the smallest thing in the exhibition, I'm sorry, is a playing card from a geography game that was designed for the young King Louis XIV in Paris. When he was still a minor and hadn't yet taken on his role as king, his cardinal protector, the regent, had a game designed, 52 cards, and different places of the world with representations of figures from those cultures. Here's Brazil, and you can see in black and white in graphic form a beautiful feathered cape, headdress, and other attributes. Brazil and the Tupinamba culture of Brazil and the Aztecs, they were the great feather painters or feather mosaicists. And so you can also find robes like the one this figure wears in Vienna that Durer had seen, and also in Mexico City and in South America. But the young Louis XIV would see a representation. Again, this is by a European artist. It's probably based on travel reports and travel literature that was sensationalized, even in 1650, so about 150 years after the first reports came back to Europe about the Tupinamba people of Brazil. What mattered most to printmakers and designers was selling your work, selling your illustrated travel literature, selling your illustrated individual prints. These were sold and made for people beyond Louis XIV when it was realized how popular they could be. So it's still a European fantasy. It's still potentially sensationalized based on making designs or prints for a market. There's key information about major cities in Brazil and major exports. And this actually comes back to another theme in the exhibition about materials that make up artworks. In Brazil, there's a beautiful red wood that was a major export that the Europeans cared a great deal about, that often would be used for carving and for other kind of cabinet making. And so it's actually mentioned in the description in French beneath that figure. But I urge you later to come look at the quality of the print. The other representations, again, are kind of European, mostly Italian and Northern Renaissance designers and printmakers thinking about Ottoman sultans, figures in India, in Asia, and the way in which they ingeniously catch birds by wearing carved out pumpkins on their heads, which allow them to go underwater, still breathe through the pumpkin, and then the bird comes to eat from the pumpkin, and then they can catch the bird. A Venetian military figure and his black African servant, and then a representation of one of the wonders of the ancient world, the great pyramids at Giza, from a series, and so a representation of Egypt, of Africa, and of black African laborers. So besides purchasing works, we try to get donations of works of art. And so a private collector gave us these 2 Ethiopian scrolls. They're thought to come from the 20th century, but they represent a tradition that goes back to the 15th or 14th in surviving examples. And it's thought that scrolls like this were created even many centuries before the 14th and 15th centuries. The scroll on the right is what I'll speak about first, but these scrolls were made as healing objects. They're made as also talismanic objects or apotropaic objects that would not only heal a person with a certain illness or sickness, but they would keep away the demons that were believed to have caused the illness in a person. There is a long process for creating them so that the parchment, usually goat skin itself, had a special relationship with only the one person it was made for. I'll just say for a moment that typically they're the height of the very person who would have used them. There would have been a cleric, sorry, I'm searching for the word, an unofficial cleric, a cleric who hadn't actually formally been ordained. They're often Christian, but they're also used in Ethiopian Jewish and Muslim traditions. The ones that we have here, which are written in the language Ge'ez of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, were for Christians, but a lot of the iconography, the symbolism, is found across the different religious traditions within Ethiopia. How are they healing scrolls? How are they magical scrolls, as scholars call them? How are they talismanic? They're made for people with any kind of illness, And up till the current century, but they were most popular up till the 19th, but still they're very popular, people would still take both Western and alternative medicine for symptoms, it was believed, but the internal spiritual problem causing the affliction, the demon that was believed to inhabit a sick person, can only be exorcised or destroyed with these Ethiopian scrolls. And so you would have to have that unofficial cleric with you who would read the prayers and blessings and occasionally Christian texts from the Bible, and who would help you understand how to use the representations. So this figure of an angel here is one's guardian angel. Most of the scrolls have a representation of a guardian angel. I'll look at both scrolls because I want to focus on the eyes. It was thought that the afflicted person, the demon would be exorcised out through the eyes of the person who was sick. And so it was most important the ocular, or the ocular power of these objects, which is why the figures have such large eyes. They're supposed to draw in the eyes of the viewer, so here the angel's eyes are large. Over here you see a series of squares, kind of lattice work lines or cross lines and others with faces, in this case 7 faces. These are interpreted differently, not only by scholars, but by the clerics who would use the scrolls, depending on the situation. But the most common usage or interpretation is that these lines represent a net, a way to catch those demons. I've spoken a lot about these, and there's a lot more about how they're made and how they're used. But if I zoom out for a second, this is one of our first, if not our very first, kind of African objects in the UCR collections that is earlier than a kind of a contemporary work of art. We're grateful to have them because they represent the tradition of illuminated scrolls, which we have a couple other wonderful things in archives and rare books from the Jewish tradition. And we have also great facsimiles at the Classics Library and the Paleography collection of Byzantine and other scrolls. But as an object, it's great for thinking about book history and for thinking about practices of reading. But at the same time, finally, we can show, alongside, for instance, this movable miniature, at least representations from some of the other traditions that I teach my students about, but are much harder to represent with actual authentic objects. And so it's nice to have objects from Africa and to think about Christianity in this case in a much wider perspective, and at the same time Judaism and Islam as well, which in the medieval art class I try to teach a little bit more about the different faiths. And so with that, I will let you guys breathe easy, and if you have any questions or comments, please. Otherwise, I encourage you, if you have a few minutes, to come look up close. Yeah, thank you so much.